The sun still stood warm over Hawthorne, crossing that October afternoon. Shadows were long, but no one believed cold could already be on its way. Wagons rattled past the freight stop, and the dust of the road hung easy in the air. At the center of the street stood Vance Mercer, a 25-year-old trail surveyor and repair hand, a man known for fixing broken bridge timbers along the freight road. He carried no bedroll, no rifle, only a canvas sack and a wooden maul tied at his belt. The townspeople did not gather out of anger. They gathered because the council had called them. Councilman Ezra Klein, the freight agent who kept order and counted shipments for the town, stepped forward. He spoke calmly, as if reading a notice about taxes. Vance Mercer had caused unrest. He had told families the winter would come early. He had said it would kill stock and trap wagons before Thanksgiving. Men shifted their boots. Women folded their arms. No one struck him. No one shouted. They simply told him to leave. Vance listened. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He only said, "You don't have to believe me." The north wind changed 3 days ago. No one followed him when he turned away. No one raised a hand in farewell. The journey of Vance Mercer is just beginning. If stories like this, full of hard-earned lessons and pivotal choices, are what you seek, hit like and subscribe. We will continue to explore how people change their fate, even when no one believes them. Because the harshest truths, like the coldest winters, always arrive in the end. Vance Mercer walked out of Hawthorne Crossing before the first snow ever showed itself. The town felt safer when he was gone. Vance Mercer did not leave town in anger. He walked with the steady pace of a man who had already made this journey before, though not from this place. Years earlier, far to the south, he had worked a railroad section line. The job was simple and repetitive. He replaced cracked bridge planks, set fresh support timbers, and checked the expansion gaps where iron rails met. The older hands rarely spoke. They only pointed. He learned quickly that trains did not fail from great disasters. They failed from small spaces left unchecked. Wind pushed long beams until they bowed. Cold tightened wood until joints split. A gap the width of a coin could loosen a structure that weighed many tons. Later, he drifted north and hired on as a trail surveyor along freight routes, marking grades and water crossings. There he met old Varick, a retired trapper who wintered alone in a narrow mountain cut. The man owned little and explained less. He watched weather instead of talking about it. One evening, while sealing a draft crack in a rock shelter, Varick finally spoke. "Cold hurts," the old trapper said, "but cold does not kill most men." He pressed his hand into the moving air near the entrance. "Wind kills. It steals heat faster than fire can give it." From that day, Vance did not merely notice temperature. He studied direction. After coming to Hawthorne Crossing, Vance Mercer spoke little and watched often. Most men judged the season by the calendar nailed to the store wall. He judged it by movement. The geese passed overhead, flying low and fast, not circling the river bends as they usually did. Snowshoe hares along the brush line had already turned pale weeks ahead of time. The creek behind the freight sheds dropped suddenly, as if the ground itself had tightened. One morning he paused beside the corral and pressed a hand to his ear. The pressure was faint but steady. Weather was building somewhere far beyond the hills. Then, he saw what mattered most. A herd of mule deer left the north slope nearly 3 weeks early, moving down into the flats without feeding. Animals did not abandon high ground without reason. Vance told the town plainly, "Snow will come before Thanksgiving." Gideon Pike, the local carpenter who framed half the cabins in Hawthorne Crossing, laughed and pointed at the clear sky. Autumn sunlight still warmed the boardwalk. Mara Dean, the storekeeper who managed the food accounts and supply ledgers, shook her head. No merchant prepared for winter based on animal behavior. No one argued with Vance. They simply dismissed him. The animals had already decided. The people had decided not to listen. The hills remained quiet, but the waiting had begun. Hawthorne Crossing answered the coming winter the way it always had. Men packed clay and moss between cabin logs. Axes rang from morning until dusk, as cords of firewood grew beside every door. Ladders leaned against rooftops while shingles were patched and nailed tight. The method was familiar. Fuel more fire. Seal the walls. Truss the stove. Vance Mercer did none of it. He did not stack wood beside a cabin. He did not repair a chimney. He did not even claim a room. Instead, he walked the outskirts each day, studying ridgelines and windbreaks. He watched how gusts curled around hills and where snow from past winters still lingered in shaded cuts. Some assumed he was searching for trapping ground. Others believed he had simply given up preparing. But on the third morning, he carried tools out of town, not toward timber, but toward rock. He left the blacksmith's stove behind. He left the boarding house behind. He left the comfort of shared walls and steady company. The townspeople gathered wood. Vance searched for stone. They prepared fuel. He prepared location. By the end of that week, he slept outside Hawthorne Crossing, and no one understood why. Isolation came first, long before winter. By the second week of October, the talk had spread beyond porches and feed stores. Families began asking questions the council could not answer. Councilman Ezra Klein, the freight agent responsible for contracts and supply routes, saw the danger immediately. If people feared an early winter, they would hoard. If they hoarded, shipments would stop. And a supply town without trade could fail before the weather ever turned. So the council called a meeting in the street. Klein spoke without anger. Rumor destroys a settlement faster than any blizzard. He did not accuse Vance Mercer of lying. He accused him of certainty. The council decided the matter quietly. Vance was to leave Hawthorne Crossing and not return until spring. Vance listened with his hands resting on the handle of his wooden maul. He offered no defense and no apology. He only nodded once. The town believed it had protected order. They watched him walk away with relief rather than hatred. No one considered that removing a warning does not remove the storm. On that fateful afternoon in 1893, Hawthorne Crossing chose the comfort of a lie over the cold survival of the truth. Vance Mercer walked north into the foothills for 2 days. He did not follow the main trail. Freight roads crossed open ground where wind gathered speed. He moved instead along broken ridges and shallow draws, stopping often to watch drifting grass and snow remnants trapped in shaded places. Near the second evening, he found what he had been searching for. A long slope of pale limestone rose above a narrow basin. Loose rock had fallen away over the years, leaving a deep talus seam, a narrow break where the hillside had opened but not collapsed. A thin seep of water darkened the stone, running even this late in autumn. Above it hung a natural rock ledge facing south. Most important of all, the ridge blocked the north wind completely. He stood there a long time, not resting, not admiring. He was measuring. A man seeking comfort would have pitched a canvas lean-to under the ledge. A trapper might have built a small log hut near the spring. Vance did neither. He set down his sack. He tested the stone with the iron chisel and struck it once with the wooden maul. The sound carried through the hollow seam behind the rock face. He struck again. He was not building a house. He was entering the hill. The wilderness was no longer background. It had become his opponent. Wood burned. Canvas tore. Stone endured. That evening, with fading light on the ridge, Vance Mercer made his decision. He would not try to survive winter like other men. He would live where winter itself could not reach him. Work began before sunrise and ended only when the light failed. Vance Mercer cut into the limestone, using a cold chisel and the heavy wooden maul he carried from town. The first blows did little. The stone resisted without cracking, and each strike sent a dull vibration up his arms. By the third day, his palms split open. He wrapped them in cloth torn from an old shirt and continued. By the seventh, the bleeding stopped. Calluses formed where skin had given way. He widened the natural seam slowly, prying loose fragments with an iron bar scavenged from an abandoned wagon axle. Loose stone became tools. Flat pieces served as scrapers. Broken edges became wedges. He carved a shallow recess just inside the entrance, low and narrow. There he placed his fire, not deep in the shelter but close to the opening, where smoke could travel upward along a natural crack in the rock. The draft behaved as he expected. Warm air rose along the slanted seam and pulled smoke away without filling the chamber. The fire burned small but steady. Days later, he shaped a sleeping hollow farther inside, just large enough to lie within. He kept the ceiling low. Air trapped low warmed faster. One evening, after feeding the fire for hours, he allowed it to die down completely. He waited in the darkness. The air cooled quickly. Then he placed his hand against the stone wall. It was still warm. The rock had taken the heat and was giving it back slowly. No extra fuel, no constant tending. For the first time, the shelter was not only blocking wind, it was storing warmth. Fire made heat. Stone kept it. Vance said nothing aloud, but the principle was proven. The shelter worked, but Vance Mercer knew blocking wind mattered as much as holding heat. He cut straight pine boards from fallen timber below the ridge and shaped them with a hatchet. Instead of hanging a cloth flap, he built a solid door that fit tightly into the carved opening. The frame followed the uneven rock. No straight lines, only careful adjustments. He packed dried moss along the edges and pressed wet clay over it, sealing the cracks where air tried to enter. When the clay hardened, the draft stopped. The change was immediate. The small fire burned lower, yet the air inside remained steady and still. He then widened a second recess along the inner wall and led in an old pack mule he had found wandering weeks earlier. The animal was slow and scarred from freight work. He named it Brass and tethered it within the side chamber. The mule's body heat filled the confined space. Warm air moved gently from the animal's alcove into the main chamber and settled along the floor. Morning came without frost on the interior stone. No ice formed on the door hinges. No vapor left his breath. That night he slept without waking to feed the fire. For the first time since leaving town, the cold did not dictate his sleep. The system was no longer a shelter. It was a climate he controlled. On the morning of October 28th, the sky over Hawthorne Crossing changed. Clouds did not gather slowly. They formed in a single gray sheet that erased the blue within an hour. The wind turned sharp and steady, coming from the north with no pause between gusts. By midday, snow fell. Not a light dusting. Heavy, wet flakes struck the ground and held. Boardwalk planks turned white before the church bell rang noon. Men stepped outside expecting it to melt by evening. It did not. Wagon wheels froze in ruts. Water troughs skimmed with ice. The first cattle refused to leave the pens. The town spoke of surprise, of unusual weather, of a passing front. No one spoke Vance Mercer's name. In the foothills, he watched the same sky from the mouth of the stone shelter. He did not hurry. He did not add more wood than necessary. He closed the pine door and sealed the latch. The wind rose through the afternoon and pressed against the ridge above him. It howled over the limestone face but did not enter the chamber. Snow struck the rock, then slid away. Inside, the air stayed still. Vance sat beside the small fire and listened, not to the storm, but to the drafts that were no longer there. The first proof had arrived. He offered no satisfaction, no smile, no spoken victory. He simply waited while winter announced itself to everyone else. The storm did not pass. Snow fell again the next day, and the day after that. Wind followed each snowfall, driving drifts against every north-facing wall. Paths between buildings narrowed until wagons could not move. The first loss came quietly. The large hay shed beside the freight yard carried too much weight. Wet snow collected on the roof beams. During the night, a support post split. By morning, the entire structure had collapsed inward, burying most of the winter feed. Men dug for hours, but the hay had frozen into a solid mass of ice. Within a week, cattle began to weaken. They stood in place rather than walk. By the second week, several were found lying stiff in the corrals. Food supplies shrank faster than anyone predicted. Flour barrels emptied. Salt pork was rationed. Coffee disappeared first. The freight wagons never arrived. The mountain pass closed before the drivers could cross. No one expected the road to stay blocked so early. The cold deepened. Doors froze shut overnight. Window glass cracked along the edges. Families burned furniture to stretch fuel. Children stopped playing outdoors. Even the blacksmith shortened his hours because the forge could not warm the building. No one spoke openly at first, but the thought moved from house to house. The man they had sent away had warned them. One evening, while counting remaining supplies, Mara Dean set down her ledger and said quietly, "He might have been right." No one argued. For the first time, Hawthorne Crossing feared not the storm itself, but the mistake already made. By mid-November, the council no longer met inside the freight office. They gathered in Mara Dean's store, where the stove still burned and the last sacks of flour were counted each night. No one spoke of solutions. They spoke of limits. How many days of food remained? How much fuel could still be spared? How long children could endure the cold? Silence filled the room until Caleb Dre, a 17-year-old stock handler who cared for the remaining cattle, spoke from the doorway. "If he's alive," the boy said carefully, "he would know what to do." No one asked who he meant. They all understood. Councilman Ezra Klein stared at the floorboards for a long moment. The decision weighed more than pride. It meant admitting the town had dismissed the only warning it received. At last he nodded. A small search party would go north at first light. 5 riders, the strongest horses left. They would follow the foothill trails where Vance Mercer had last been seen. No one claimed certainty he would be alive. They did not even claim he had been right, but they prepared to ride anyway. It was not belief that sent them out. It was the absence of any other hope. The search party rode for 3 days along the lower ridges of the foothills. They followed wagon ruts where they could, and game trails when the road vanished beneath drifts. Snow lay deep in open ground, but the hills broke the wind enough for the horses to move. They found no cabin, no canvas shelter, no fire pit in the open. By the 3rd afternoon, provisions were already thinning, and the riders began to consider turning back. Then Caleb Dre pulled his horse to a stop. He did not call out at first. He only pointed. High along a pale stone slope, a thin gray line rose into the sky. Smoke. It did not bend. It did not scatter. The wind that day cut hard across the ridge, strong enough to push the riders sideways in the saddle. Yet the smoke climbed straight upward, as if guided by an unseen pipe. The men stared for several seconds before anyone spoke. They dismounted and climbed toward the rock face. The slope held nothing. No chimney, no hut, no stacked timber, only a wall of limestone. Then, as they moved along the base of the cliff, one of the riders brushed snow away and exposed a wooden edge. A door stood set into the stone itself. The men said nothing. They did not yet understand what they were seeing, but each of them felt the same thought forming at once. The storm had not found him, and perhaps he had not been guessing after all. Up close, the door did not resemble a cabin entrance. It was built from rough pine plell, toggle boards, cut unevenly to follow the natural curve of the rock. Snow clung to the surrounding stone, but the seams along the doorframe were clear. No ice formed along the edges. One of the riders ran a glove along the hinge and stopped. The metal was cold, but not frozen solid. In this temperature, exposed hardware should have been locked in frost. Caleb Dre stepped forward and removed his glove. He pressed his bare hand against the wood. It was cold, but not biting. Not the sharp, skin-burning cold of the open air. The men looked at each other. The difference was small, but undeniable. Caleb raised his hand and knocked once. The sound carried inward, dull and hollow, as if the mountain itself had answered. They waited. For a moment there was only wind, scraping along the cliff face. Then came another sound. Footsteps, slow, measured, approaching from within the stone. No one spoke. No one moved. The riders, hardened men who faced storms and cattle drives, found themselves hesitating before a simple door. Outside lay wind, ice, and failing supplies. Inside was something they could not yet explain, and for the first time, they feared opening it. The latch lifted from the inside. The door opened slowly, not forced against drifted snow, but swinging freely on its hinges. Vance Mercer stood in the doorway. He looked thinner than when he had left town, but not weakened. His coat was worn and darkened by soot, yet his hands were steady and bare. He was not shivering. For a moment, neither side spoke. Behind him, a dim orange light moved against the stone walls. One of the riders expected to see smoke pouring out or heat escaping in a rush. Neither happened. The air at the threshold felt calm. Vance stepped aside without greeting. "Come in," he said quietly. The men hesitated only a second before Caleb crossed the entrance. The moment he passed the doorway, the wind vanished from his ears. Inside the chamber, a small fire burned low in a shallow recess near the opening. It was not large enough to warm a cabin, yet the walls around it were dry, not glazed with frost. The floor was bare stone, and it was not frozen. Strips of meat hung from a line farther back, stiff but not solid. A stack of carefully split wood leaned against the wall, hardly touched. From a side alcove came the slow breath of an old pack mule. The animal shifted and released a cloud of warm vapor that drifted lazily, not snatched away by draft. Another rider entered, then another. One removed his gloves. He waited for the sting of cold to seize his fingers. It did not come. He exhaled. No cloud formed before his face. The men stood in silence, listening to the quiet crackle of the small fire. They searched for hidden vents, for blankets, for some concealed furnace. There was nothing, only stone, shaped by hand, stone that held warmth and released it slowly into still air. No one asked Vance how he had survived. The question had already been answered. Outside, their town burned furniture to last another night. Inside, this place required almost no fuel. The riders understood at the same moment. The man they had sent away had not escaped winter. He had prepared for it, and the preparation worked. No speech was given, no apology spoken. The truth stood around them, silent and undeniable. The walls themselves had proven him right. The men remained inside for several minutes before anyone spoke. They stood near the doorway, as if unwilling to disturb the stillness of the chamber. No one wished to be the first to admit why they had come. Vance Mercer ended the silence himself. "How many are left?" he asked. Caleb answered. His voice was lower than before. "Most of them, but not for long." Vance did not question how the town had treated him. He did not mention the council or the order to leave. He only nodded once and looked toward the entrance where the wind pressed faintly against the sealed door. "There's a valley east of here," he said. "The ridge blocks the north wind. Snow settles shallow there." He knelt and traced a line in the dust with a piece of charcoal. "Deer winter in it. You'll find game if hunters move carefully, and there are more rock hollows along the cliff band. Not carved like this one, but enough to shelter families." The riders listened closely. "I'll show you the way," Vance finished. No man asked why he would help them. The answer was already clear in his manner. He was not offering forgiveness. He was offering instruction. Outside, winter decided survival without regard for pride. Inside, Vance prepared to teach them how to meet it. And so, the journey changed. It was no longer a search for a missing man. It became a path towards staying alive. 3 days after the search party returned, an unprecedented scene unfolded at Hawthorne Crossing. The town was nearly empty. A grim line of people moved in single file, leaving their homes behind. Women wrapped children in blankets. Elderly men rode on sled, runners pulled across packed snow. Bundles of food and tools were tied with rope and stacked onto crude drags. They did not travel as pioneers. They traveled as refugees, forming a long, solitary black streak against the blinding white snow of that brutal year, 1893. Vance Mercer walked at the front. He did not give speeches. He did not reassure anyone. He simply chose the route. He avoided open flats, where wind scoured the ground, and led them instead through shallow cuts and behind ridges where the air lay calmer. When they stopped near the cliff band east of the basin, he began assigning places. Families were grouped according to size. Each was guided into a separate rock hollow. He showed them how to pack moss and clay along the openings to block drafts. He demonstrated where to build the fire low, near the entrance, and where not to place it. "Heat the stone," he told them, "not the air." Men copied his actions carefully. Women stacked fuel in small amounts instead of great piles. Children carried armfuls of brush to keep flames steady but controlled. Night came early. In the first hours, some still shivered and waited for the cold to creep in as it always had. But it did not. The stone walls slowly warmed and held the temperature. The wind howled outside, but inside the chambers, the air remained still. Before dawn, one family slept through the entire night without feeding the fire. They did not celebrate. They simply realized they were alive because they had listened. The following days became routine, though no one called it comfort. Vance Mercer moved from shelter to shelter, checking each opening and each fire pit. He corrected small mistakes before they became large ones. He showed families how to burn a short, steady fire against the stone, and then let it fade. The rock would release warmth for hours afterward. Fuel lasted longer. Sleep came easier. He taught them to hang meat along the inner wall rather than near the entrance, where cold drafts would freeze it solid. He pointed out how to watch drifting snow along the ridge to read wind direction. When the snow lifts and moves sideways, he said, do not leave the shelter. The storm follows within the hour. Hunters followed his instructions into the shallow valley he had marked. They found mule deer exactly where he said they would be, feeding along brush that remained uncovered by deep drifts. The first animal taken fed several families. Confidence grew, not from hope but from repetition. Each day his advice proved correct. Fires burned lower yet warmed longer. Food stores began to stabilize. People who once waited for instructions from the council now waited for his quiet inspection. No ceremony marked the change, yet it was clear. The town no longer depended on buildings or supplies. It depended on knowledge, and that knowledge belonged to the man they had sent away. The great storm arrived without warning. The morning began calm. By afternoon, the sky darkened. By evening, the wind struck. It did not build gradually. It came all at once. Gusts tore across the ridges, driving snow sideways so hard it stung exposed skin. Trees bent and snapped along the basin edge. Loose ice lifted from the ground and spun through the air like sand. Inside the stone hollows, families sealed their doors as Vance had shown them. Small fires burned low against the rock. No one stepped outside. The blizzard roared through the night. In Hawthorne Crossing, empty cabins took the full force of the gale. Unoccupied roofs lifted and collapsed. Doors broke inward under drifting snow. Fences vanished entirely beneath white banks. At the freight yard, the counting house stood alone, shutters nailed tight against the storm. Councilman Ezra Klein had remained behind to guard what property was left and to maintain order if survivors returned. He trusted the solid walls and iron stove he had depended upon for years. But the wind found every seam. Fuel ran low. The stove cooled. Cold crept across the floor and rose slowly into the air. By dawn, the storm moved east. The basin shelters opened cautiously. No drifts blocked their entrances. No frost covered the interior walls. Every family inside survived the night. When riders later reached Hawthorne Crossing, they found silence and broken structures. Inside the freight office, they discovered Ezra Klein seated at his desk, coat wrapped tightly around him. The stove beside him was cold. He had died not from violence, but from certainty. The storm had judged without anger. Those who prepared endured. Those who trusted walls alone did not. No argument remained. By late March, the wind finally stopped returning. Snow no longer fell in sheets across the basin. Sunlight held longer each day, and meltwater began to move beneath the drifts. Families stepped carefully out from the stone hollows and looked toward Hawthorne Crossing. The town still stood, but it was no longer the same place they remembered. Fence lines lay broken under packed snow. The freight shed roof had collapsed inward and hardened into a frozen mound. Livestock pens stood empty. Several doors could not be opened at all, sealed by ice from the inside. No one described the storm itself. They spoke instead of what had allowed them to endure it. They spoke of the quiet air inside the rock, of fires that burned small and lasted long, of sleeping through nights that once required constant tending. Vance Mercer did not stand among them as they looked over the damage. He remained at the cliff, adjusting the pine door of the shelter. He scraped away old clay and pressed fresh seal along a narrow crack where winter had tested the frame. While others told stories of survival, he repaired the place that had made survival possible. There were no arguments now. No one questioned what had happened. The storm had passed, but the lesson remained. They understood they had not lived through winter by luck. They had lived because one man prepared for it. When the roads cleared enough for travel, the people of Hawthorne Crossing gathered. They did not meet inside the church. No one suggested it. Instead, they stood together in the open street, where the damage could still be seen in every direction. Broken rails leaned in the snow. Collapsed roofs remained where they had fallen. No one spoke of fate. No one spoke of God's will. They spoke of choices. Caleb Dre stood near the center, hat in his hands, his boots still dusted with thawing snow. "We sent away the only man who understood winter," he said. The words carried easily in the still air. No one interrupted him. Mara Dean stepped forward next. The storekeeper, who once counted supplies more carefully than opinions, kept her voice steady. "I trusted the inventory," she said. "I believed preparation meant having enough goods. She paused before finishing. It was not enough. Gideon Pike, the carpenter whose cabins had sheltered the town for years, spoke last. The buildings held as long as they could, he admitted. The design was sound, but it was built for ordinary cold. He looked toward the distant ridge. This winter was not ordinary. No argument followed. No one defended past decisions. For the first time, the people did not explain what had happened. They accepted it. They looked at one another directly, without excuse, and the silence that followed held more honesty than any sermon. Someone finally walked to the foothill path and asked Vance Mercer to come to town. He arrived on foot, carrying no tools this time, and stood at the edge of the gathered crowd. He did not take the center of the street. He did not climb the church steps. He simply waited. The people expected a speech, or perhaps anger. They received neither. Vance spoke only a few sentences. "The wind does not care who is right," he said. "The cold does not care who is good." He paused and looked across the damaged buildings. Winter respects only preparation. No one interrupted. He did not mention being sent away. He did not ask for apology. "You owe me nothing," he continued calmly. "You owe Winter a lesson." The words carried farther than shouting would have. Then, he made a simple offer. Anyone who wished to learn could come to the ridge. He would show them how to seal a structure, how to read moving air, and how to store heat instead of chasing it. He offered no promises of safety, only knowledge. Vance did not wait for approval. He did not ask for thanks. He stepped back from the gathering as quietly as he had entered. The town watched him leave again, but this time, not as an exile. There was no victory in his manner, no satisfaction. The man who had been proven right did not behave like a winner. He behaved like a teacher, and that humility carried more weight than triumph. Within a week, the first young men climbed the path to the ridge. They did not arrive as visitors. They arrived carrying tools. Vance Mercer put them to work immediately. There were no lectures. He showed them how to seal the edge of a door with moss and clay, so air could not slip through unseen cracks. He taught them to hold a strip of ash in the air to watch how wind moved around a corner. He demonstrated how a shallow rock recess, properly shaped, could shelter better than a wide wooden wall. Hands that once hauled freight now shaped stone. Boots that once trampled snow now paused to study drifting powder along the slope. They learned to listen before acting. Soon a saying spread through the settlement: "Don't listen to the forecast. Listen to the ground." No announcement marked the change, but it became clear. Young men who once laughed at Vance's warning now repeated his methods to others. Knowledge moved from one set of hands to another. The lesson was no longer held by a single man. It had become a practice, and in that quiet exchange, Hawthorne Crossing began to change. Summer returned, and Hawthorne Crossing rebuilt. But the rebuilding did not copy the past. New houses rose with low entry passages that bent the wind before it reached the main room. Food stores were buried halfway into the earth, banked with packed soil instead of standing above ground. Barns and corrals were turned away from the north slope, using ridges as shields rather than obstacles. Every change was small by itself. Together, they altered the settlement. People no longer spoke of winter as a season that arrived and departed. They spoke of it as a condition that always waited beyond the hills. Children learned to check wind direction before chores. Travelers were advised where to camp, based on terrain, not distance. No proclamation declared a new method. No official rule was written, yet the pattern held. Structures now worked with the land, instead of against it. The lesson had settled into daily practice. Hawthorne Crossing did not defeat winter. It learned how to live beside it. Even after the town rebuilt, Vance Mercer did not move back into Hawthorne Crossing. He kept his place along the limestone ridge. Travelers occasionally asked why a man who saved the settlement chose to live apart from it. They found him working as before, repairing the door seal or clearing fallen stones from the entrance path. He answered simply, "Up here, I hear the wind sooner." The explanation satisfied him, though not always the listener. He came to town when needed, helped raise beams, and inspected new construction. But when the work ended, he returned to the cliff before nightfall. He neither avoided the people nor joined their daily routines. He existed beside the settlement rather than within it. No resentment appeared in his manner, no desire for recognition either. The place that once sheltered only him had become his chosen home. The town accepted this without question. They understood that some men did not belong at the center of a community. They stood at its edge, watching what others overlooked. And so Vance Mercer remained where he could listen first. Years passed, and Hawthorne Crossing grew into a steady stop along the freight road. Drivers bringing goods through the mountains received the same advice from every resident. If you travel late in the year, speak to the man on the ridge. Many did. They found guidance instead of stories. Vance showed them windbreaks, safe camps, and places where snow would not drift deep. After his death, the path to the stone shelter remained worn by visitors. Inside the entrance, carved into the wood of the old door, they discovered a simple line cut by hand. The wind always speaks first. Men listen only when it is too late. No monument marked his life. No plaque carried his name. But every winter, travelers still chose their camps by terrain and not convenience. Families sealed their homes before the first frost rather than after. The lesson endured without ceremony. Hawthorne Crossing did not remember a hero. It remembered a principle. Nature never argued. It only proved. If someone in your town warned a deadly winter was coming early, would you believe them or call them a liar? Tell us in the comments.